Well, hello again, everyone. This is Chris Joslin, your host for another edition of JOZ Bytes coming at you. Sponsored as always by iLevelLogistics.com. Come visit the site, join the conversation, the community, be a part of broadening the understanding and the scope of the logistics supply chain industry. It's an important in the community today, in the industry today, and inside and outside of the industry. There are so many things going on, so many challenges that all are interconnected, and we link those things together with what we like to call the supply chain. And I like to try to go over some particular points within the industry to give people a broader understanding, whether inside or outside the industry, of what's going on. But once in a while, we bring on guests as well to share with us a little bit about their background, their companies, what they do for a living, how they impact supply chain and the transportation industry, and how we can learn from them, all of us, including myself. It's with that I welcome a guest today, Mr. Steve Ramescu, the president of Axsun Group, a company he formed in Canada almost 20 years ago. And I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that today, and how he's grown that company from what I believe was a small drayage company to begin with into a very large multi-dimensional company. Intermodal, over the road, brokerage, warehousing, a lot of technological applications and RFP management in 3 countries, I believe, Canada, US, and Mexico, and how he sees both the future of his company going, the future of our industry, and some of the pitfalls and challenges that we have along the way. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Mr. Steve Ramescu.
Slice and dice.
Hey, how long you been growing it? How long you been growing it?
Well, I really don't let it grow too long, but I've been looking like this. I got at least 2 years, 3 years.
I got to tell you, I do love that our style of business, at least unless you get into the big corporate room sets or on some travel thing where you have to put on the tie again. I've got a handful of ties, but I got to tell you, I don't use them very often. I don't know about
Chris,
you, but I love that.
I haven't used my ties in about 3 years, and I'm holding out long enough till they come back in fashion.
Which is hopefully, well, here's the question. Did they come back in fashion as thin ties or big fat ties?
I got a little bit of both. I'm more medium and fat, it's like kind of, and the thin one, I think those ones are gone.
Exactly. I got to tell you just a quick thing. It's so funny because I started with Hub Group back in 91, I guess it was. And I remember as a young sales guy, and I wasn't really that young at that time, but as a young sales guy, I was out at this meeting, and lunch meeting, which was kind of hilarious back then with some of the older guys. And they were all down at one end of the table, jawing about this, that, and the other thing. And I was at the other end of the table with a couple of other young guys. And I remember turning to the guy next to me. I go, if I'm that old and still in this business, yakking about that stuff, put me out of my misery. And sure enough, here I am.
Well, here you are.
It's interesting, Steve, because this industry, to me, it's got so many layers that it's once you get in, it's kind of either you don't want to or you can't get out, because there's so much going on and so much to talk about and do, so many challenges that come up. And I had a little preamble before you jumped on here, just a brief about your background. Thank you very much for taking a few minutes to join me today and just have a chat about some of the things that either, get your hair standing up on end, which you and I both have a problem with that these days. Or
shooting down.
Yeah, exactly. Your reputation in the business has always been that you've got a lot of opinions, and that is, in my personal opinion, something that's kind of lacking in our business space, because there's been a lot of corporatization, and you've got a large company now. I don't think you started as a large company. It's been about 18 years, 19 years, something.
Yeah, Axsun's been around.
So,
I guess it's about 18 years now.
So tell me what got you going to start Axsun.
Well, I started my career in a small company. I started off in telemarketing when telemarketing was just taking off, when it was the new thing. Within about a year, year and a half, I became the most successful salesperson the company had ever had or seen. And while all the other salespeople were doing the old traditional, going on the road, to see your 4 or 5 customers a day, and you'd show up to the office maybe once a week in a Monday morning and a Friday afternoon, whatever, to do your reports. I was spending most of my time in the office just working the phones and working the phones. I became very successful, and it kind of changed the MO how the other salespeople started working, because they saw the success that I was having. So they started adopting a little bit what I was doing.
So was that in a totally different space?
No, this was in transportation,
Oh,
selling
was.
piggyback service.
Piggyback.
And
Okay.
piggyback service, when it was only 45-foot trailers at the very beginning. And this was prior to double stacking. Transit times based in Montreal. I was moving stuff out of Canada going into California that would take 23, 25, 26 days. By the time you made all the rail connections, people don't realize that the UP is actually 2 railroads, that came together, and so is BNSF. BN was brought into the same thing. So, and there was Conrail at the time, which obviously dissolved into half NS and half CSX. Yeah, the IC Railroad, which is now part of CN, Wisconsin Central, which is now part of CN, or GTW, I should say. The world was different at that particular moment, and I was successful. And the owners at that time didn't want me to leave, so I was able to purchase part of the company. I didn't own a lot. I owned personally 2.5% of the company, but when you're in your 20s,
that's unbelievable.
That was like, wow. And we ended up selling the company eventually to a larger company up in Canada. I stayed on as vice president for about 10 years. Sometimes in a large company, there's a lot of entities trying to steer the ship. I mean, it's my personal view, and it was my opinion, and I didn't like the way the ship was being steered. To some extent, it felt like the tail was wagging the dog a little bit. At that time, I stayed on as vice president. I was there for about 10 years. I was about 38, and I'm going, I'm coming into my 40s, and do I want to stick around and do this, or do I actually believe in what I say? And you mentioned about people having opinions, and yeah, everyone's entitled to opinion, but a lot of times people don't execute on that opinion. I said it's either now or never. Either you kind of shut up and dissolve into the crowd and move with the mass, or you trailblaze and you believe in what you think is right, and you commit to it and you do it. And I did. So I started Axsun 18 years ago. Here we are today.
Boy, it flies by, doesn't it? 18 years for Axsun.
18 years, yeah.
And I remember when I saw that logo for the first time. I think it was probably just when, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you started primarily just as dray, right?
No, it was intermodal. Went into intermodal. The dray component came in probably about a year after I had started Axsun, a year and within a year in that time frame, year and a half. It was a funny story, because one of the carriers that I introduced where I used to work, I brought this carrier into the fold. They asked me if they could participate in business, and I gave them an opportunity to come in. And when I had started Axsun, I thought he was a friend as well, and started doing some business with them and growing with them, and they helped me out. I had a infamous phone call with them one time when he called me up and said, I got to raise your rates 10%. Rates were escalating at that time too, for various other reasons. He told me it takes an effect tomorrow. And I go, well, hang on here a second. You can't just tell me it starts tomorrow. I mean, you got to give me a week or two, whatever, so I can pass on these costs and do whatever. And then he said, well, I'll tell you what, I can do what I did for your other company, was only charge them 5% now and 5% the following month. I looked at him and said, so I introduced you to intermodal, which you never did any drayage. I'm giving you all this business, and you gave my competitor preferential treatment that you would never have been involved without me. He kind of got caught in his words, and I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll accept your 5 and 5, just like that. He did accept it, and during that 30, 60 days, I started setting up my own drayage operation, and decided from there on, I was going to control as much of the destiny I could. Keep in mind, you can't open up a drayage company all over the place, because the volumes may not be there to survive or to be efficient.
You got kind of pushed back into a corner, and you said, well, you can either take it or you can change it. So,
exactly. So we
yeah,
changed it. So now we've got our drayage operation in certain parts of Canada and certain parts of the United States to control the volume mass that we have. So we're not really like a gun for hire drayage company that everybody can call, although some of our competitors do use us. We have,
hmm
like anything, you can't control life
sure.
100%. And certain businesses just naturally gravitate to other companies. And I'd rather participate in a small piece of the pie than no pie at all.
Sure,
Right?
exactly. It sounds to me, and maybe the story is similar with the other pieces. It sounds to me like okay, you had intermodal, kind of the background of familiarity with moving piggyback cross country and all the different gyrations you got to be an expert back in the day, especially with all the different roads, to do that and to understand where it's going to commit the communication on the different transit elements of it, et cetera. But your intermodal, your highway, your drayage, your warehousing, your technologies now, and you're in Canada, Mexico, and US. So
Yeah.
it was all of that kind of like, okay, the customers are demanding more of me and I'll add these services, or do you have a kind of a more holistic picture than that?
Combination of both.
Yeah,
When you're sitting down with your customers and you're doing a good piece of business with them, and you always ask them what else are they doing and where's their potential opportunities. And you don't make your decision based on the feedback you get from one, but geographically, when you're talking to certain customers in certain areas, and then you start kind of looking like a puzzle, right? You start putting some pieces together and you say, this will fit. Let's give it a shot. And from there, it grows a little bit
hmm
and it takes a life of its own as time continues. If it's successful, well, it will take a life of its own and
hmm
continues to expand from there. And from that expansion, sometimes it leads to another piece of the puzzle that you never even
sure.
thought of. A lot of times
Now,
when you're building a business, it's not because you've got this master plan. Sometimes that master plan is fed to you from a small thing that you did over here,
sure.
became something else over here, which became something else over here that you never saw till you got that first piece of the puzzle.
Now, have you seen that strategy as now, obviously it's been great for you to have that happen, but have you felt at any time when you're going down these new pathways that that's diluted your core competency at all? Or has it been the right timing so far to attach and just make you, I don't know, more appealing to your customer base?
No, I don't think it's diluted what we do. I mean, at the end of the day, we do transportation, and intermodal is the background that I came from. I started this when I was 18 years of age, and I'm 56 today. So I've always come from the intermodal background, and long
Right.
before it was popular, no one had an idea what intermodal was. 38 years ago, and now it's the big trend because of the certain environment with truck situation,
Sure.
right? Everybody wants to jump on the train. No, at the end of the day, we're still doing transportation. You're still focused. You've got a bill of lading. You may have custom documents, and whether the mode is moving over the road or by rail, there's
Mhm.
there's a lot of similarities. So I kind of look at it as saying all we're changing is the portion of the middle component, because at the end of the day, a truck does the delivery and a truck does the pickup, whether it's
Exactly.
rail or over the road. You got to get that final mile done with the truck. So
Yeah.
what happens in the middle is really I guess, a component of cost, a component of service, and a component of desire or opportunity for the customer, because sometimes
Well,
customers want to use that benefit to open up other markets for themselves.
right. And certainly there's a cost component that a customer's looking at their KPIs and saying, I've got this budget, I want to constrain it. And they look in that middle section most often.
Yeah,
And having the background of intermodal and that expertise it's not cost prohibitive to do something like that. It can be time prohibitive depending on where you're going and where you're starting from, et cetera. But the
absolutely.
interesting thing to me about intermodal, and something I looked at back when I started, is I was like, hey, this is kind of autonomous. I mean, not entirely, you've got an engineer and things like that, but and I don't remember if it was you or somebody else I was talking to the other day that said, hey, this move to autonomous vehicles, well, we kind of already have some of that in place.
I
It's
told you
called, you told, okay,
that.
I think I had heard, well, I heard, I'm going to give my own head credit for hearing that and understanding it properly, because I think that's lost on the industry a lot. I mean, not from the insiders, but from people looking on the outside and saying, oh, there's this drive for automation. The technological framework to get the guys on the highway to be truly autonomous is going to be a stair step from drivers to pilots to semi-autonomous to maybe fully autonomous sometime out in the future when you and I are hopefully on a sailboat somewhere. But
Exactly. I mean, intermodal has been there and it is autonomous. And the beautiful thing about intermodal is that it has its own tracks, it has its own highway. So it's not interfering with vehicles on a day-to-day basis on the streets. The difference is we're in transportation. Maybe we're not as great marketers as Elon Musk in telling the world how great autonomous is. But even today, I mean, most flights, you get on a plane, the plane is autonomous, but you still have pilots on board, right? So I'm not, you say that, we'll be on a boat somewhere. I'm thinking we're not even going to be on this planet in our lifetime
that's very
when
possible.
that ever happens. I think we're still far away from that process. And there might be some avenues to use some of the autonomous trucking for some shunting or in a controlled environment in a terminal but I still think we're a long way away from taking every highway in North America and the back roads. Personally, if I'm driving a car or you're driving a car, you have kids in your car, I think you'd really feel uneasy knowing that there's this truck that weighs 90,000, 80,000 pounds, whatever the gross weight of the trailer is that day, racing by you with nobody on board.
The thing nowadays that makes me kind of uneasy thinking about that is the projected 18-year-olds doing the same thing, in the United States, and in that whole, I got a feeling we could probably talk about different elements of this industry in a lot of depth. And I think there's always two sides to the coin. There's pros and cons for all of this stuff. But I didn't want to shirk my responsibility of asking you about assets, because one of the things I think a lot of people have missed in our space, especially in the intermodal space, they use, OPEs, right? Other people's equipment, but that should only be a component of what you do. My belief is that you should at very least be asset light or a hybrid of OPEs in your own. And I think that's a direction you took. You've got containers, you've got trucks. Is that continuation going to happen for you?
Absolutely. As we grow, we see that continuing. And the other most important thing that we did was about 10, 12 years ago, we brought in SAP technology, and we were the only ones in the transportation industry that use it from head to toe, that manages our intermodal fleet, our trucking fleet, our warehousing, our invoicing, the whole thing. We run 100% on SAP.
See, let me stop and ask you, because SAP is System, Application, and Products. If I believe that's what it stands for, if I remember correctly. And I remember when I first heard about that was back when I first started transportation, and the transportation guys weren't using it. It was the manufacturing, right? It was an enterprise resource program, and they were developing efficiencies through that. How did you apply that technology to your business?
Well, first of all, when you on the transportation side, railroads were on SAP, steamship lines, they're on SAP. The largest corporations in the world were SAP. And, the latter part of the 90s and 2000s, everybody was trying to create their own software, and everybody was trying to come up with a magical software that can, whistle Dixie at any time you wanted to.
Sure.
The problem with that is that while everybody is doing that, there wasn't really some commonality between connections and being able to streamline the process. And some of the technology being used was already outdated. There's still people still running AS400 systems. When we sat back, we had a system that, at the beginning, like a lot of people, when you're small, you buy some sort of software and that got us off, on our feet. And then when we had the big financial crisis, we sat down with the people at SAP, and we basically took the profits we did over the first 5 years and said, we've got to do this. If we want to get big and we want to be able to communicate with customers on their language and have the presence, infinity from expansion and never having to worry about the platforms or anything else, we decided to go with SAP. And it was a good partnership that we had with them and the writers that developed our system. It took about a year to get it all done. And during the financial crisis, there was a very good incentive. And SAP also wanted to show that their system could work for small enterprises as well.
Sure.
And we took on the challenge. We implemented it. Mm-hmm. And to this day, it's the backbone of our ability to grow. So we can grow to $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion whatever. You've got some of the most brilliant minds of the world building SAP. I don't have to worry about that.
Right.
And as far as an IT department, you know, a lot of companies, they always have their IT department somewhere in the back because they like to grow like mushrooms, right? You know, in the dark, you open up the door, there's 4 of them. Then you close the door, you come back 3 weeks later, all of a sudden there's 6 IT guys. You close it back, and then there's 12, and you're wondering, what are they doing? And they're all throwing papers all over. Got this report, that report, this report. And I get it, right? They've got so much demands. But with SAP, at any given moment, I never have to worry about my software anymore. And if anybody wants to, you know, communicate electronically or hook up or into their supply chain,
You're already there.
Say the 3 words, 3 letters, SAP, and you know that 10 questions you get about your IT automatically disappears.
Well, it seems to me that you took the route. A lot of people do, as you said a little bit ago. They take an independent route and try to create their own software, particular to whatever their focus is, and that's great if you want to contain your business to a certain size. But if you want to implement that across a broader scope of client, then having something that communicates with them on a way they're already communicating is huge. Plus, I mean, that's a mark. Forget everything else. You started out as you were on the phone calling people, so you know that marketing is like job number 1. And when you have commonalities like that, technologies like that, that can be scaled up to any size, I mean, that's a huge deal, I would imagine.
The latter, you know, for the longest period of time, everybody wanted to be a non-asset provider. And we kind of grew up in that environment. You know, non-assets, every time you heard something, people said, oh, you want to be non-asset based, you know, and at that time, yeah, it kind of made sense. If you only went down that path, you're kind of in trouble right now. We wanted to have assets in strategic locations. Our assets don't run all over the place. They run strategically in lanes that we know we can optimize. COVID kind of changed the non-asset based model. A lot of people still seem to forget that many trucking companies declared bankruptcy and have gone by way of the dodo, and they're gone, and they haven't been replaced. And the economy went into a standstill. And now the economy went into full swing, and people are playing catch up. Unfortunately, the equipment is no longer there. The drivers may have migrated to something else. There's such high demand, and drivers have historically been low-paid salaries. I mean, they weren't treated. I wouldn't say treated fairly, but they weren't paid fairly for what they are. Now everybody all of a sudden has this love affair that, oh, gotta love the driver. Well, you had to love the driver many years ago.
Exactly.
And we were in the industry always crying wolf to customers, saying, you know, there's going to be a shortage. You know, drivers are getting older. It's tougher. And maybe we saw this as an industry, you know, 10 years ahead of time, because we kept crying wolf every year. And if you remember correctly, and customers kept saying, yeah. And every time they send out an RFP, the rates kept going down.
And therein lies the real problem, because there was always somebody to fill that gap at a low rate. Those guys are probably the ones you're talking about, are by the way of dodo, right?
Yeah.
They went too low. They kept everything contained in COVID, and the challenges that ensued during and after that have created a different, you know, I think what it's done is it showed kind of the fragility of the supply chain in a way that we hadn't seen in the past. We always see it with, earlier last year, the Ever Given and the Suez Canal, and what happened there, or a flood on the Mississippi, or a lot of big snowstorms in your neck of the woods up there in Montreal. All those kinds of things will affect the supply chain in different ways. But the one thing that I've seen, I should say 2, because they're both asset related, the 2 things that I've seen that have helped people get over the hump or continue on, or fill the space for these people that are going away from the industry, is chassis and containers. Those 2 elements, the drivers aside, you know, I'm talking about the physical assets. So I got to share with you, I remember in the early 90s doing a ride along with Phil Yeager, the guy that started Hub Group, great guy. He was sharing with me on our drive somewhere how he and his sons were basically arguing about whether they should continue to be completely asset free or go become asset light. And he said, and I'm losing the argument, and I know we're going to end up asset light. And I've got a picture somewhere of the very first Hub container coming across the border in Mexico to be delivered. So, and I thought that's going to change everything for them. And it did. And I think what you've done, and I don't know, what numbers you're up to or anything like that, but it seems to me from what I've watched, you have a systematic way of bringing on more equipment. And, who doesn't love the logo? It's got to stand out, and your freaking logo stands out. That's good.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. When you see one, you think you see 100. I mean,
well, that's what you want, right?
yeah, exactly.
I got to ask you though. I say you're everywhere. I see, Axsun Canada. I see Axsun USA. I see Axsun Mexico. And I got to ask you about that because I think you're a big vision person. I don't know, maybe I'm giving you too much credit, maybe I'm not giving you enough, I don't know. But that's what strikes me. And on those three things, those are obviously different countries. Are you treating them in a way that they're like one economic block, or do you specifically design your products for each of those entirely different from one another?
I think it's kind of like the combination of everything when you're looking at it, because you just can't say I'm going to do this over here and not do it over here, because then you end up with a lot of fragmented pieces, which start to get very, very difficult to manage. The business model we've adopted, with SAP and our asset is to be, to optimize everything and maximize capacity, whether it's through the cubes or through the people.
Yeah.
And that software allows us to do more things. One of my competitors, with the technology we have, they may require 3 people where I only need 1 or 2. So there's that component. So and when you implement a component like that, you implement it across the board, right? You just don't say, oh, well, this is only good for United States, but let's not talk about Canada or Mexico. You do it for all, because everybody will benefit across the board. When you're looking at it, you always got to look at all the pieces that you do business with and see if there's a fit. And if there's not a fit across the board, okay, well, is this something you really want to isolate? Or is it something that is really going to, go back to one of the things you asked, are you now divesting yourself where you start sacrificing certain components of the business? There's a risk reward factor, and you got to weigh it out and decide from there.
It sounds to me like, and I've seen a lot of companies that would take an approach that says, okay, here's our base core competency, and then we're going to be a designer element in these other directions. And that does not sound like what you believe in. Certainly there's a component of exercising due diligence and creating a solution for a customer or a base of customers, whether it's in one country or another. But it sounds to me like the combination of equipment, the components of the supply chain that you're dealing with, which is drayage and highway and warehousing and all these technologies. But the two things, the equipment and the technologies, allow you to give a designed product that the customer can look at and know they can fit into, instead of something that they have to adapt to.
I think you're bang on. Is that you've got to look at where your business is going, but you got to look at where your customers are taking you also down the path, and you've got to be able to adapt to them. And for another example that we probably do that nobody's done yet is, as an asset provider, we're the first intermodal company to implement BlackBerry radar on all our containers. So when we're talking about tracking, we have our tracking systems that are hooked into the rails to retrieve the information, and reports go out to customers that are, very efficient through SAP. However, the novelty of radar allows us to know the customer can actually follow the container on Google Maps, and they have a link to that container, and they follow it until the end of their voyage, and then that link expires. So obviously there's a security issue that you don't want people following the containers all across the board. But those things also tell us, if the container is loaded, not loaded, how much cube is being loaded in the container, is there additional room that the customer could benefit from? There's a lot of things that you can do with it. So we're always trying to advance with the customer, see where they're going. High value product customers, example, they love following their containers, and with that BlackBerry radar on the unit, they know if there's a breach. I mean, if those doors open, we get alerted immediately.
Right.
So and quite often we know that it's in the rail yard before the railroad actually notifies it's in the rail yard, because we're able to follow it a little bit more extensively.
I love the technological aspect of this business because it just keeps advancing. There's been things that I've seen 20 years ago that I don't the electronics industry a lot. Shipping with the electronics industry and high value is a stage where a lot of these things are implemented first. RFID stuff, technologies, the stuff you're kind of talking about now, all those things are data points. And what drives these big customers to more efficient management of their supply chain is data points. And back to what you said a few minutes ago about the pandemic, I have noticed, as I think the whole world has, that the supply chain is a little more important to them than they ever knew before. Whether we're talking about vaccines or whether we're talking about your toilet paper in the store, right?
Yeah.
And before I got in the transportation business, I worked in a retail store selling people PS1 computers of all things. And if I would have invested in that, maybe I'd be on that sailboat we were talking
You got to be careful when you say PS1 because now people think that's PlayStation.
Oh, you're right. No, this was way before.
You're showing your age, Chris.
Unfortunately, I am. But the funny thing is I remember talking to my manager at the time. Why is our back room so empty? And he goes, "Well, you're selling like crazy. I love the commissions and the spiffs and the different stuff, but that was the only thing I really thought about in terms of transportation logistics. Why isn't that truck here to give me my product so I can give it to my customer?" And I never went beyond that. And nowadays, I think that the industry, it's one of the reasons I like doing what we're doing right here. It's partly to teach people that are inside our business more about it, a different understanding of maybe some of the regulations that are coming down or some of the differences between how things are managing cross-border or internationally, whatever the case may be. But it's also because people outside the industry are starting to look at this and say, how does this affect my daily life? And it's bringing more people to our industry, which, for old guys like us, especially guys that like the technology, we can see how that's going to develop, and we can see that it's going to be good for the industry as a whole, and make it more hardened, make these supply chain links more hardened. That's what I think we need. But let me kind of just finish off with the main question. It's very general. You can go any direction you want, but I know when you sit back and look at your business model and some of your competitors and some of the things that happened, especially over the last couple of years, that there are plenty of challenges. So, and if you're anything like me, you look in two directions. You look in a lot of directions, but the main two is you look inward and say, what are the challenges for my company overall? And then the other is, what is the industry challenges over the next 1 to 5 years? Do you see those two things lining up for you? And what do you, there's a lot of challenges, but what do you think is the number one focus that gives you where the future of your company is headed?
Well, I think every day is a different challenge, and you never know what the environment throws at you, from a road blockade to a virus to a war that's going on. There's so many things that come in that your challenges are changing rapidly, and our industry is moving quickly and needing to adapt. And I would say probably the biggest hurdle is going to be the ability to adapt quickly for people. We've got to be on our toes and be able to change with the wind. A lot of companies are still operating like they did 20 years ago, and those guys aren't going to make it. They're still very systematic. Their protocols, the hierarchies, and I think if you're looking in enticing younger people and people to get into our industry, you can't work the old ways. Right. Things have to change. So the hurdles would be being quick to change and getting people into our industry. We're still an industry, although we've made it, kind of from behind the classified pages now to maybe page 2 or 3. We're still not quite on page 1, but and understandable. When you got viruses and wars, there's other things, but we're slowly being tied into that because every time something happens, the supply chain has become so critical for everything that I think people have started realizing that for the last decade or two, with the suppressed pricing, and when you look at it, transportation companies, whether they were public or non-public,
right,
trying to make a good amount of money off the equipment or the capital that was required was very, very difficult at best. And I always, tell people, I look at, on the smartphone, whether you got a Samsung or an iPhone here, people line up to pay $2,000 for a phone that maybe cost $150 to make. So the
Right.
profits are enormous, yet, we carry 10,000 of these phones in a container. We charge a customer $3,000 or $4,000, and we're lucky to make $100 at that time, gross margin on the move. And
These two things do not line up.
they don't line up. So it's kind of like the old saying, the meek shall inherit the earth. Well, transportation for the longest time has been the meek.
Right.
And when people, I remember prior to COVID, I mean, some of the pricing was cheaper than it was 25 years ago. And 25 years ago to today, the salaries have gone up, the compensation's gone up, the insurance has gone up, the equipment has gone up every day. The prices continue to rise, yet the transportation rate was being suppressed. And a funny thing happened when a customer asked me a while ago, said, Steve, when do you think it'll go back to the way it was? And I kind of looked at him and said, you mean to go back to the time when transportation companies made no money, is what you're saying. Well, for us to invest, as a whole industry, for us to invest to get people into our industry, to get the equipment, trucks, the containers, the chassis, expansion of the rail network, the roads, it's got to be profitable. And the only way we can invest in the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is broken. It really, when you look at it, the transportation infrastructure is broken. It just can't handle the capacity. Drivers are overworked, they're overstressed, there's a shortage of everything. And it's time that people start realizing that, it's not about just price. It's about getting your product to the market safely, on time, and reputably. And I think the younger generation, they're very cognizant of fairer trades and a little bit more equality, and sharing, which is a good thing, because as they come into the industry, they'll understand that yes, a company does need to make profit. And for the longest period of time, if a transportation company made profit, it was like, ooh, taboo, how dare you? But
we're not cost centers, we're profit centers. We're supposed to be, right?
Exactly. And for anybody that doesn't understand that, I tell them, well, why don't you go see how much it costs to buy a truck, and then get a driver, and how much to insure it. And then when you're looking at someone that you're asking someone to do a local delivery for $200, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
The numbers just don't work. So that's going to be the biggest hurdle.
And I think that the supply and demand curve in a general way has brought us to this point. And there's enough people now, there's enough entities within our system that have vast amounts of equipment to control that a little bit. Now, so what you just mentioned was kind of two things that really jumped out at me. Number one, if you compared it to like something that's going on right now, every time I look at my watch and see the stock market, is we seem to be in correction territory for an industry, right? It's been running along at this kind of run rate or sell rate that's been insufficient to produce the kind of hardening of the infrastructure we need to make the future happen the way it should. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, it's been dominated by big, slow turning vehicles. I don't mean trucks on the road. I mean companies that are very slow turning and not nimble. And so what I've been talking to people a lot about lately is really coming up with more of a formula for nimble logistics, if you will. There are way too many infrastructural pinch points, not just in our country, but internationally. That's where the renewed money that's coming out of the industry as we start to go through this correction, the reinvestment needs to go into the places to loosen up this whole thing. And that's going to be wonderful to watch happen. And, I've still got plenty of time left in this industry. I know you do too. And we're now the old wise guys, if you will. At least we like to
we're
think
old.
so.
We're at least
we got at least that part. At least we got half of it down, right?
Right.
But
that they can't take away no matter what.
Hey, Steve, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I really appreciate you coming aboard for a few minutes today to chat with me about some of this stuff. And I think I would love if you have the time in the future where we could lay out something that's kind of stuck in your craw and you'd really like to dig into deep and talk about with the audience. But in the meantime, congratulations on all the growth you've had for Axsun. It's been wonderful to watch happen. And gosh, I'd love to talk to you more about this in the future.
Anytime, Chris. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. Well, that was terrific. Thank you again, Steve, for coming aboard and sharing some of your expertise and time. And certainly you've never been remiss for advice and your position on the challenges we face today. It's tremendous to have people like yourself aboard, and I thank you very, very much for that. And again, I would encourage everyone to see us on any one of a number of podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can certainly go to YouTube, subscribe. We want you to be a part of the community. We want you to grow with us and broaden the understanding both inside and outside the industry for the importance of supply chain and the multifaceted challenges that we face today. And I very much look forward to seeing you again on the next edition of JOZ Bytes.